Great. So welcome. My name is Joe Cap, and I am the founder of the National Center for Resource Development. Today, we're going to be talking about rural and rural ecosystems, and I am one of the co-founders of Rural Rise. I'm super excited to welcome our panelists today who have just a fantastic array of experiences. And I'm going to ask them actually to introduce themselves individually and just their backgrounds a little bit more. We have Christy, who is the executive director of the North Dakota Women's Center. Christy, please say hello and share us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. Christy Dower joining you from Fargo, North Dakota. And I am the executive director, as Joe mentioned, of the North Dakota Women's Business Center. And we work to support the entrepreneurial community in many ways, including access to resources and economic impact, and telling the stories in the collective voice of our rural business owners. So excited to be a part of the panel and excited to meet each of you.
Great. Thank you so much, Christy. Ann McMahon, welcome from the SBIR from Iowa. Tell us a little bit more about your background.
Sure. Hi there. Good afternoon. Ann McMahon, zooming in from the heartland here in the middle of the country in Des Moines, Iowa, where I like to say we feed and fuel the world. So I run America's Seed Fund here for the state of Iowa, focusing on quality over quantity of applications, kind of all over the space. We do have 4 kind of area focuses, not for SBIR, but for kind of the other side of the house, where we try to uncover and unlift bio-based products within the university. So they're bio-based products, health tech, a lot of stuff coming from the University of Iowa, big 10 research facility, vaccines and immunotherapeutics, obviously for animals, but we also love and care about humans as well. Then lastly, digital and precision agriculture. So I would just say I'm a people person and a connector, and I've been in my role for about 5 years, and I just love connecting good ideas with people to help move the needle for early stage non-dilutive federal funding, and happy to be here.
Yeah, great. And thanks for joining us. Super important work, especially with everything that's going on these days. Mark, welcome. Thanks for joining us as well. And you're a partner and fund director of the Greater Colorado Venture Fund. Tell us more about yourself and about the fund.
Yeah, you bet. I guess I got my start in entrepreneurship as one of the co-founders of Startup Weekend, and grew that into Up Global and handed that off to Techstars about 8 years ago now, and ended up finding myself in the middle of nowhere in Colorado and falling in love with some of the challenges and opportunities out here, and realizing that a lot of our rural communities are microcosms for what's happening on a larger stage across the nation, and even all of Western society, you could argue. And if we can't figure out how to solve those problems in rural communities and small towns and on a county level, how are we going to do it at a state or a national level? At least some of that dysfunction and that wealth and opportunity gap. And for me, entrepreneurship is the why and the how. And so through that, we've launched Greater Colorado Venture Fund, explicitly focused on companies in rural Colorado. It's a seed fund. Average starting checks of 300 to 500. We just wrapped up our first fund of 17.5 million with 30 investments. We've had 5 exits in the first 4 years, and just about a month ago we closed on our fund 2 at $25 million.
Wow, that's great. Well, fantastic, and congratulations on all of that. So let's dive into this just a little bit, and Ann, I'll throw it over to you. Because you mentioned animals. So rural's a little bit of a different animal, right? Like when we talk about entrepreneurship and ecosystem development, maybe share some insights about what your thoughts are with regards to rural and rural ecosystem and entrepreneurship.
Sure. So it is a little bit of a different animal, but I still think it starts with infrastructure and people and building communities, and then kind of go from there. A way kind of is to build it and they will come. But if you build alongside with the people and do some customer discovery out in the community to see what they're lacking, where some opportunities are, and where you can connect there. But also, we're sort of lucky in a way too that it's small, right? Iowa's small, and people and connections are just one call or email away. And so I think it's very dynamic that if you are trying to build something, or if you're new here and you're trying to get connected, it's pretty small, and people are wonderful and happy to help.
Yeah, that's great. Christy, what are your thoughts on rural being a little bit of a different animal?
Yeah, certainly. In different forms of going to business, different market strategies, urban versus rural markets. Over 50% of North Dakota's population is considered living in non-metro areas, according to a 2020 estimate. So North Dakota has a very large geography. And for us as a statewide organization, we have a lot of windshield time. I will say there is a lot of power visiting the places and spaces of, our rural towns and communities. When you stop in a coffee shop, they're driving decisions that are that are affecting change locally and statewide, and sometimes even, throughout the metro. And so there is a lot of power in visiting the places and spaces that business owners are proud of. And so again, just a different market strategy, but certainly leveraging that power of visiting the smaller communities.
Mark, I'm going to throw the question over to you, but before I do, I just want to let people know if they have a question or they want to go ahead and share something, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function. Mark, I'm going to take what they've said now, I'm going to add a little twist to it, because you're doing this on the investment side of things, and having been in this field for probably close to a decade now, investing in rural is something a little bit more new, and it kind of dovetails with my next question, but tell us a little bit more of your take on the rural piece.
I think, especially coming from a very global perspective to a very local, hyper-local perspective, the dynamics are completely different. And we always like to say, when you come into a rural community, you're guilty until proven innocent, especially as an investor, right? But it's just a reminder of we're human, and business and entrepreneurship is a very human predicated and even primal thing. And it's based on trust and relationships. And that's so evident. And, that plays out into the impacts that startups can have on their local communities, right? Because successful companies, startups, end up being the ones who sponsor the local, Little League team. And, they're the host of the event, and they sit on the jerseys, board, right? Like, it's so tangible, so human, in both a challenging and very beautiful human way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I like to say, along with my the co-founder of Rural Rise, Nathan Oley, if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. And so, there's a lot of independence, and having the opportunity to go ahead and teach the entrepreneurship globally, you really begin to see that. Let's chat a little bit about funding piece, because, by and large, we've seen a lot of funding and talent and resources and startups that's been concentrated in urban centers. And so understanding and how we build out rural ecosystems, sometimes there's a little bit more of an advantage when it comes to building businesses and supporting that. Christy, I'm going to start with you. Your thoughts on why start a business in a rural community to begin with?
Leveraging the speed of trust in a rural community is probably the single most important factor that I've seen as we support rural ecosystems. Instead of chasing the big businesses, thinking of it as a spider web into all of the other communities that surround it is something that, I'll often phrase when I work with the developers or, city planners. But, as an entrepreneurial resource center, we have the tough job of how to, encourage not just the attraction, but the retention. What are you doing to empower your youth? We've seen some fun experiences where youth, you get to be a mayor for the day, or you get to, join a committee and engaging that youth to stay involved, and then hopefully retain them when they go off to college and come back and continue to influence those. And specifically in North Dakota, we have a rich collection of business stories. We have a rural training facility in Devil's Lake that inspires Olympic excellence. We've got trucking and distribution companies that deliver our agricultural goods. And what I've found is that the local communities are so willing to connect and be thinking partners along one another's journey. And it's really powerful when you see that community collection come to fruition. And then lastly, when it comes to funding, it's one of those things where who are you asking? And leveraging that local community partner. But North Dakota has a lot of different funding options specifically for rural and unique community events to engage and retain their communities and the investment in those communities.
Yeah, and the SBA makes a whole host of tools available for people who are thinking about starting businesses, and there's even been a renewed focus on rural communities. And I'm curious about your take on this. Why start a business out in a rural community, especially some of the businesses that you mentioned are really getting to fairly technical pieces. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I think it's to leverage the collaboration and the talent. Well, talent workforce is kind of sparse everywhere. The people that are here are good and are all very connected. So I'd say leverage people in your backyard and your talent. As well as collaborating, right? So especially with vaccines, there's a CyVax lab in Ames, which is 40 miles north of us here in Des Moines, that collaborated with human vaccinations over in Iowa City. So the collaboration that we see cross state is wonderful. And then try to help shift the mindset, right? And get stories and get good PR about, oh, wow, there are smart people in rural areas doing cool things. And maybe not to get you to necessarily move here, but to consider it and change the narrative and kind of flip the mind shift, and culturally too, which is always an uphill battle. But those would be my remarks on that.
And one of the things that I'll add, and Mark, I'm going to throw this over to you, is also the ability to be able to access, in many regards, people in cities are very busy, and the ability to be able to access people who you might want to get in front of. In many regards, in a rural community, it's oftentimes quite a bit easier. And you might be sitting at that with, next to them at a baseball game or, in the restaurant, down Main Street. Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
100%. Right. Like we always say, signal to noise, and signal is so much higher in rural communities, tends to be. And I think we're fortunate in Colorado where we have some of the tourist hubs, where we have a lot of folks who have second homes and whatever. And so we often talk about the companies get built in the truly rural places, but they can leverage the assets, financial network, intellectual capital that exists in some of those hubs. And so signal it's absolutely an advantage.
Yeah, and we saw that, particularly as it relates to COVID and the significant increase in populations and migration to rural communities, in part, not just to build a business, but also to be able to have a life and live a little bit of a more normal entrepreneurial life and a little bit more balance, certainly in rural communities. And in some regards, also starting up in a rural community, because costs can also be a lot lower. And so when we talk about costs and money and funding, Mark, I want to go ahead and talk about that piece, because that can be a little bit of a challenge. And really just looking at in the past, a lot of the federal funding has probably been a little bit more concentrated in urban centers. What are some ideas, especially with the work that you're doing in Colorado? It's just so fascinating. You guys are doing some really cutting edge work around this. So talk about the funding that can take place in rural communities, and then we'll share it with the other folks as well. Yeah.
On the funding piece specifically, we have a long way to go. And I think that was one of the impetuses of getting into this. Is I was working with an accelerator program, right? Kind of the start of the pre-seed kind of launch pad, so to say, and ended up seeing a lot of deals that were at that seed stage level. And I think there's kind of this push-pull of, do you start all the way? Do you really need to, what's more important, chicken and egg, the pre-seed fund, the friends, family, angel networks, or is it the more institutional capital? The answer is we need both.
Sure.
We have found kind of jumping in, and it's harder to organize. It's a little more nebulous when you have angel networks and some of the friends and family type funding programs, even if they're tied to a bunch of, across Colorado, we've got a bunch of programs that have been tied to like incubators and accelerators. We found that as we created a seed fund, we created kind of a call it downstream pull, which we could come in and with a little more institutional lens, kind of set a little bit more clear criteria bar that helped get the earlier stage funding mechanisms a little bit more organized as well. So we've kind of seen, again, the answer being a push and pull on both sides. and the necessity of it. But the reality is still there's huge swaths of this country across rural who don't have access to either of those options. So
yeah, we can do better for sure. Hey, Anne, America's Seed Fund, SBIR, right?
Yeah,
Talk to us about that and like the rural piece, because Mark's coming at it from a different angle, and the SBIR program is a great program. So please share with us in the SBIR piece.
absolutely. So can I get a hallelujah for it being reauthorized, right?
Amen.
We still have lots of work to do. There's only 1,000 days
Amen.
left. So write your Congress people and get it going. I say we have to get creative, right? So we are really successful at USDA. And everyone say, oh, and that's obvious, But we look not only at USDA, small to mid-sized farms, we look at rural and community development. So we have a lot of success with education technology, high-tech education technology, medical devices, health tech that has gone virtual inside. Like, what are you bringing and how are you going to bring it to the rural community? So we have a lot of success there. And I think I would say about 25% of my winners last federal fiscal year for FY22 were from rural areas. So that's also great. But that's also where a lot of my deal flow comes from. And then also, I think you have to ask, right? It's a double-edged sword. A lot of the funders say the pipeline's terrible and the deals are terrible. A lot of the entrepreneurs say, no one wants to give me money and no one has money for me in my stage. So I think it's both have to kind of get in a room and talk about it and also ask. The entrepreneur has to be more creative and open with asking. And I think the angel funder needs to be more understanding, or any venture-backed funder needs to be more understanding about the entrepreneur and their role too, and kind of what happens on either side.
Just to volley on that, if I
Mark,
can.
please, yeah.
And like one of the things that we found as a funder is, and we try to bring in other funders from, call it the Front Range in Colorado, Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins area, the metro area. But we find that their expectations are like startups that are coming out of Boulder. They expect the companies to come with that level of polish, the same vocabulary, what I call the unicorn dance, right? And the reality is we're finding incredible founders, incredible companies in rural areas, but they don't have the vocabulary. They haven't been exposed to that culture. That doesn't make them any less competent. In fact, might be the opposite in most cases, right? And so it's that where do you engage them, and oftentimes describing the difference between debt and equity, even to very sophisticated or later stage entrepreneurs, is where we start the conversation.
Yeah, and the vocabulary and where you meet people, where they're at, and all of those things. I remember, touring a cattle ranch and having conversations about, super fascinating innovations that were taking place in a rural community with farmers and ranchers, but the conversations were really different language. And so those pieces, I think, are super important. Christy, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, certainly we've got a variety of options to fund your small business. As it relates to the work that we do specifically is helping build that foundation. And you're right, I think the vernacular we use as entrepreneurial support is, you need a whole glossary. And I think somebody put in the comments another 400 hours, and I couldn't agree more, just to get familiar with, the due diligence of, investment and what that means and all that stuff. Where we exist as an SBA resource partner is we rely on the nexus of support. So we don't have to be experts in everything, but we really have that nexus of support. So where we excel is we actually built a virtual library with using some COVID funding. And what I found was, during the pandemic, we were trying to answer the same question over and over and over again. And how do we get that tools and that critical resources out to, the small business community across the state in a more efficient manner? We built a custom resource tool and then made it free. And so put specific resources to help learn and help understand the challenges that small businesses face. And then building that strong foundation, because when you have that strong foundation and you know when you're going to cash flow, or when the opportunities are going to arise, or perhaps there's scalability, or and having those informed decision making tools is that's where we exist as a support organization. And so funding is certainly out there. There are grants out there specific for rural communities, and ours is just more of relying on that nexus of support and building a strong foundation to make those informed decisions. And then again, I just say, just ask, because many entrepreneurial support organizations probably have a focus written in, their funding structures of finding those, those hidden gems within the rural communities. And so, just going into those small communities and finding a thinking partner, and building those connections or investment opportunities. And just ask. There's a lot of power in that authentic conversation.
And, Christy, you raise a point that I think is also super important as well, is that it's not always about the money. A lot of the pieces that are out there are resources to be able to help. And that can be technical assistance. For those of you that aren't familiar with technical assistance, that really means like helping you get your arms around the things that you need to do to help your business grow and scale it to the next level. Sometimes it could be assistance with maybe transportation or daycare. In fact, I spoke not too long ago with a community in Canada, and one of the things that they offer within their entrepreneurial ecosystem is actually a social worker. Certainly for me as a serial entrepreneur, going through the mindset piece, a half a dozen times in a variety of different ways. And so actually in many regards, particularly in a rural community, it takes a little bit of a village. So I want to switch hats for a second from our entrepreneurs and talk a little bit entrepreneurial ecosystem, because there's some new programs and some programs that have existed for a little while with regards to navigation and building ecosystems, excuse me, and bringing people together from an ecosystem perspective. So Anne, maybe go ahead and jump in on this question about your thoughts about entrepreneurial ecosystems in rural communities.
Yeah, sure. So I think that everyone, like stakeholders, right? Everyone needs to have a voice at the table. And I think there's 5, government, universities, risk capital, the entrepreneur, and one other I can't think of right now. Maybe someone else can pop it in. So I think they all, and no one's at the center, right? So some people say the entrepreneur drives it. I don't think that's really typically true. They all have to be doing equal shares, depending on the project, to get it to move. And so I think it's hard. It's especially hard because the level of adoption and trying to change the narrative, like, oh, if you're an entrepreneur, you don't have a job. Well, a farmer is the original entrepreneur. And so if we could leverage farmers, and they're smart and they're working with data and agriculture out in the field, albeit with their hands, they're the original epitome. So if we can kind of help build up some of the original entrepreneurs, then there may be a better add-in and adoption to the community, especially the smaller and the more rural, about that and building, and how everyone needs to have their hand in the pot to help and uplift at the same time.
Yeah, it's a little bit like a good old-fashioned barn raising, right? We're going to go ahead and bring the whole entire community together. Mark, what are your thoughts? Because a lot of where you're focusing is on the financial side of things, but I am curious. You were shaking your head in agreement with regards to technical, capacity building and those sorts of things, which is a lot of what the ecosystems do. What are your thoughts on rural ecosystems?
Just in terms of our role, we view ourselves as a venture fund. We basically operate like an accelerator, a non-time bound accelerator. We provide so much of that hands-on, deep. We do workshops, we do retreats, we do all kinds of stuff that most investors don't do. And part of that is bringing, developing that ecosystem and the skill base across that ecosystem. But one of the things that we found to be most useful is actually startup weeks. I'm super biased, given my background, having launched those all over the place, but the playbook is exactly the same. And as a VC, we lead the capital track, or help lead the capital track at the startup week for Western Colorado. And we're starting to see more of those pop up. And again, I think there's a question in here about technical tools. And I've struggled with this all the way since my startup weekend days, but I love all the tools. In theory, they're so great. I always come back to the human, especially post-COVID, whatever world we're living in now, right? We can't get away from the human aspect of entrepreneurship, and whether that's in big cities or in rural communities. So the power of events and bringing people together that's never going to go away.
Well, and it's interesting because, and Christy, I'm going to throw this over to you, but there was 2 statistics, one that came out of the Coffin Foundation and the other one that came out of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And after funding, the biggest challenge that entrepreneurs have is networking and networks, right? And so accessing those networks. And so, you know, the importance of the ecosystem. And we talk, for those of you that maybe aren't necessarily aware of the entrepreneurial ecosystem, it's a gathering of those peoples, those resources, those institutions that help uplift entrepreneurs and help take them to the next level. And part of the role of those is to help ease some of that networking. Christy, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, it absolutely. Networking, resourcing, mentorship, is vital because the road goes both ways, right? And I think there's again, I digress. There's power in that authentic conversation. There's power in growing your business, but also reaching a hand out to those, those businesses that are like-minded, trying to grow right alongside of you. And so I do believe there's a lot of power in that. That, again, that authentic conversation. We have a Microsoft campus here that sponsored a bus, and we took the bus to a rural community, Oaks, North Dakota, and it was a Ben Franklin store that transitioned into a growing small towns community resource hub, and we filled the bus, and we spent the entire day. We popped in and out of these and heard the stories, heard the relationship, but one theme was really consistent. And it was, the continuous connection and driving traffic through those small towns. And so North Dakota as a state has, invested in arts and culture along the highways. And how do we, bring those across the state and make that space shorter in between perhaps those small towns. But that, that bus trip, and now she's doing it annually, the magic really happened in between those conversations because it would pique your interest, but the community connections. And, as a result, there were, other events popping up in these small towns because there's such a rich story to be told in those small towns and over, a cup of coffee.
Yeah, no, for sure. And for those of you who are listening, from an ecosystem perspective, at least the definition that I always had was anybody who shows up and is willing to go ahead and be assistive in a rural ecosystem. And that really runs the gamut. When I was working in West Virginia, we had the opportunity to work with the West Virginia National Guard and use their drill hall in order to bring in farmers and growers and ranchers and do an innovation showcase. I collaborated very closely with a local community college, K through 12 schools, churches and religious institutions, 4-H clubs, you name it. There's a whole host of folks that can come to the table and really help build out. And part of this is taking, the lead to be able to identify the folks that are there within the community because they want to see young people grow businesses and develop new opportunities locally. So I want to take a couple of the questions that I see here in the chat, and I don't know if any of you have any thoughts on introducing technology ecosystem solutions for rural communities. I know that we as Rural Rise have hosted a monthly conference call, video conferences. Actually, we've been doing it way before COVID, but in order to bring people together on a regular basis. I am curious if you guys have seen any technological solutions that might be assistive in this regard. Any thoughts on that?
So I'll jump in and kind of plug SSTI, Science, State, Technology, Innovation. It's a membership-based, technology-based education and economic development group that we're involved in and have been involved in the last, 5 to 7 years. And it's really the quality of people that come and the amount of work that they get done. So it's, policy versus politics, but there's a lot of policy people that kind of can help move the needle in the politics there as well. So SSTI is great, and you can be involved in many different levels and whatnot, and their conferences are awesome, and they're always in a rural area. I just was in June. I was in Rogers, Arkansas. So, very small, very rural. If you leave Northwest Arkansas and go any further south, it's the Delt where the education is, less than third grade, 80% of them at the reading retention, as well as try to get your small business development center technology designation. Iowa State University just did. And then they won the FAST Federal and State Technology Award, so another $125,000 because of their technology denotation. And they applied instead of us this last year, and they won. So try to get the technology denotation with the SBDC. So that you become an SBDTC.
And just a reminder for all of those listening for the vegetable soup, the small business development centers are located throughout the country and are there actually to do a lot of work. In fact, I had a wonderful opportunity when I was working in West Virginia to work with an SBDC coach, and just did an amazing job in a rural community, helping understand. And actually, it's really unique, particularly SBDC coaches in rural communities, because they really understand the landscape and they can help bring, a project along or an entrepreneur along in that regard. Christy, I'm curious if you have any other thoughts along the technology side. I will add that a good old-fashioned Facebook group in a rural community, it goes a long way. Like, we don't have to go ahead and get too crazy here, but I'm curious, Christy or Mark, if you guys have any thoughts in this regard.
Yeah, absolutely. You do not have to recreate the wheel, and so you're right. Building that network and leveraging, resources perhaps outside of the boundary of your state. You mentioned the SBA resource partners. So one of them I call SBA the umbrella, and you've got SBDC, you've got VBOX, so specific resources for veterans, SCORE, and then Women's Business Center, which I represent. And we exist in that ecosystem to be that thinking partner. Many of the technology opportunities are out there. I can give a shameless plug for our library, again, that custom built on-demand software, but really an array of topics from human resources to government contracting to startup assistance. And, due to the grant that we received during COVID, it's free. So I can pop a link in the chat, but certainly an opportunity to, just at least upskill. Like, how are you upskilling your own, working on your business instead of in your business? And there's certainly plenty of resources out there. The way that we got buy-in was we reached out to the main streets across North Dakota and built a roadshow around, just going in and looking for those influencers. Every small community has an influencer that's tied to, the other 5 people, and they're generally on Main Street, and they're generally, owning a small business. So who are those influencers and that you can, network with and help build that. So I can drop a link for our on-demand resource.
Yeah, fantastic. And the 3 of you should be shaming me because I didn't mention libraries. You brought up library in a different context, but I see Paul Johnson bringing it up. Rural libraries are a great place to go. And I'm not just talking to go through, different books, but man, those librarians, a good friend of ours runs Every Library, which is a national organization, super supportive of entrepreneurship. And let me tell you something, those libraries are great ecosystem builders. They want to be able to help. Mark, what is your thoughts on this as a technology aspect? Because we also have to be mindful of rural communities and broadband. We're not going to go down that path right now, but we have to be mindful of that as well. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Yeah, I'll be a little bit contrarian to a lot of other folks, I think, consistent with like the bus tour that Christy was talking about, though. We just launched our second fund, I mentioned. We did this for the first one, but we're going to go do a version of the kind of Steve Case Rise of the Rest, our mini version in rural Colorado here. And it's a bunch of in-person events. And what do we hope comes out of that? I'm really, we've encouraged people. This was pre-COVID when we started. But, meetups, startup weekends, ignites, TEDx's, 1 million cups, right? Like, I'm especially in a post-COVID era, I think folks are a little allergic to the idea of organizing community and events again. I think we need to figure out how to get past that for the sake of entrepreneurship on some levels. Look, making sure that we're as inclusive as possible because there's plenty of legitimate reasons for not. And so I've seen a lot of the events even go hybrid, but go in person, bring everybody together you can, and create the open doors for people to join. And all you need is a Zoom account, and I'll echo your Facebook and LinkedIn are sufficient for 80 to 90% of the community organization efforts that we need to do.
And I got to applaud the SBA folks for putting on this, rural panel, because oftentimes when we talk rural, the Department of Agriculture, USDA, gets a lot of credit, and they're doing amazing jobs over there. But I think what happens is not just the SBA, but so many different agencies have a focus on rural as well. And so it's really great to see the SBA, doing the work to really help support and uplift, rural communities. I'm curious if you guys have any more thoughts with regards to the ecosystem building piece. We're going to be getting in the last couple of minutes here. Any other thoughts on this, Christy or Mark? Ann? With the pandemic, there were so many things. One of the things that we saw, getting back to this conversation with regards to technology, there were so many folks in rural communities. There was a lot of education that took place, that had to take place in a very short period of time. And I suppose that as we continue to look out, I'm going to ask you guys a little bit off script here, but if you were to look out from your lens, maybe 5 years from now, maybe a little bit longer, what are some things that people should be thinking about from a rural community? We've heard a lot about the metaverse, virtual reality, augmented reality. What should people in rural communities, maybe in order to get out front of the curve, if you guys have any thoughts on that side of things?
Mark? I'll give an angle on that question. But when I kind of look to the future, this is kind of teeing off the last question too, but there's a lot of urban versus rural when it comes to even ecosystem and community building. So you could, envision building a bunch of silos, trying to connect the silos. But culturally, there's been so much of a lot of the folks that we work with too that kind of default to this us versus them mentality.
Sure.
And I think investment, even a hypothesis, we even say our thesis is rural entrepreneurs in rural Colorado are underserved. We think there's value in that. If we're successful 20 years down the road, I actually hope there's no need for any rural focused VC firm.
Right.
So we're doing a good job and kind of map to that, right? It's no longer an underserved community in terms of capital for entrepreneurs. So how do we get there? We need to start building those bridges right away. And so back to the events, making sure we bring people in, or we've worked with other groups to sponsor sending a bunch of folks to Denver Startup Week so that they can kind of get plugged in and be immersed into that.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is really this idea that in the future you'd like to see a world where there's no urban rural, it's just entrepreneurship, right? And there's no real distinction because what's available in one place is available across the board. Is that what I'm hearing?
Exactly. I think that's a really important nuance to keep in mind, because if we keep thinking and constantly doing or building things separately without building bridges at the same time, we might create even more separation.
Sure. Christy or Ann, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think in ecosystem building and trying to recruit and get people to come and jump on your bandwagon, I've thought a lot about trying to go to events where people like me wouldn't go or don't look like me, especially in rural America, or try to find one or two influencers from not the other side, but from different groups and different organizations, and I'm going to come to your event to know what you guys are about. You're always welcome here, and try to extend a hand in a way that's a little bit more unique than just why aren't that pocket of people coming or showing up, or why aren't we have too many men and no females, or that sort of thing, but trying to just go to other events that maybe I wouldn't necessarily think about going to or be found or be seen at, and trying to open the door and leverage a hand. I'm going to come to your stuff, also come to mine, and then we can try to work that angle on opposite ends and try to meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, so bringing in the diverse groups of audiences and identifying, but also being intentional. Oftentimes when we talk about rural, there can be an idea that there's a particular type of archetype or something like that. And what we know from research and data and actuality is that the rural communities have a beautiful array of folks from all different backgrounds and experiences. Christy, any thoughts on that piece?
Yeah, diversity, power and diversity. And, North Dakota is proud to, I was just visiting with, some of the refugee resettlement programs in North Dakota, and how they feed into the entrepreneurial ecosystem as well, bringing in, cultural perspectives. But there's power in sitting across from someone that, is a different socioeconomic class, gender, race, ethnicity, etc., and just in power and in that diversity. And so encourage you to, check those biases and connect with someone outside of the region. And then, Secondly, what is the question that we asked the tough question for my local community just recently in a branding conversation. We asked the tough question about what is the story that we're telling ourselves about our community, and and what does the branding look like of our community, and what's the story we tell ourselves versus what is a visitor? Like, have you ever just, checked out have you sat in a community coffee shop and asked the visitors? And it's pretty telling. And having been born and raised in the same town, I had a very different vantage point of what I thought people were coming to our community for. And so there is power in just asking those tough questions about your community, and then what do you want your community to be known for? And there's a big difference. So, being that welcoming space for diverse populations is something, checking those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that those, really bringing, an array of people to the table. And in fact, if you look at the data out of the Kauffman Foundation, some of the largest groups of entrepreneurs really come out of our immigrant communities. And so the opportunities, if you're willing to give up everything that you knew in order to come, to start a new life, the opportunities to be able to start a business are often quite big. I want to recognize that piece because it's important. When you look across the United States, different rural communities and the fabric, what the compositions are, and also the resources. But one of the things that we pride ourselves on Rural Rise is really starting with what you have already. Oftentimes rural communities will look, out into the distance, but there's a wonderful array of resources and opportunities that already are existing within the rural communities, and understanding how to leverage those opportunities that exist currently. I want to go ahead and ask Mark. I know that you're working and beginning to see, at the beginning of our call, you sort of mentioned a little bit more about what you're starting to see. Would you mind just sharing, based on your guys' backgrounds on the funding side of things, just a little bit more about what you guys are kind of starting to see in terms of identifying businesses and those sorts of things?
I would say I've been here almost 8 years in Colorado and in rural, and I think there was kind of a hypothesis with programs like accelerator programs that funded both state and federal money. I think SBIR programs included for a number of them. And, should we keep funding those was a big question in years 4 and 5. And now that we're kind of over that 6, 7, in the last 3 years, we've seen a lot of big wins, to the point that I think the state and others are now saying, how do we get 5 more accelerators into even more rural communities? Right, and make sure that they're flavored and appropriate and aligned with what's right for that community. So I think that's a big win, because those start to organize some of that earlier stage capital and angel networks. We have something called the Colorado Angel Network that really just launched in the last handful of months, but their effort is to now organize a bunch of different chapters across rural Colorado, each chapter having anywhere between 10 and 100 members, based on where they're at. And then, I think in terms of seed investment, I mentioned that we've had 5 exits as well in the first 4 years of funding. And we also have one thing that goes kind of unmentioned by a lot of venture funds. We've only had 2 write-offs. So the failure rate is significantly lower than most. And I think, we talk about, grit and ethos and culture and DNA and rural. We see that manifest itself in lower failure rates. But what that does is allows us to build a capital ecosystem that can be predicated on lower failure rates. That's a piece of it. But also, we're not reliant on the Moneyball strategy or the power law curve of, building the next Facebook to create real, not just perceived success, but economic value and impact in these communities.
Well, listen, I think I want to make sure. I think we're coming to a close here. I just want to be mindful of our time here. I have one last question. I'm gonna take the question: mentor networks and the next generation of entrepreneurs in rural areas. Any thoughts on that? Mentor networks or entrepreneurs in rural communities, next generation student entrepreneurship education. And Christy, Any thoughts, Mark?
Sure. So we've got sort of, it's not in my wheelhouse, but I can speak to it. It's an interesting, we're a big insurance capital of the world too here in Des Moines, in Iowa. So we have the Global Insurance Accelerator, and their program runs on a 100-day accelerator with mentors. So they meet with 100 to 200 mentors. And so they've built out that mentor program. I'm happy to share a connection to those folks and how they've done that and how we can replicate that. As well as we've globbed on through the Kauffman Foundation, we as in the John Papa John Entrepreneurial Centers, in Ames and in Iowa City to the Venture Mentoring Network out of MIT. So the pilot just switched. We use the MIT branding to try to get that to be really aggressive on MIT's pilot, and we're doing some changes, but you look into that too, and I'd be happy to speak with you or connect you to the person who runs that as well for mentoring.
Great. Thank you so much. Christy, Mark, any last word?
Yeah, there's there's quite a few different entrepreneurial resources for youth, lemonade days, or different platforms for inspiring those youth to think in different ways. There's some strategy and some statistics around the kindergartners of today are going to be accepting jobs in the future that aren't even thought of yet. And what does AI do to the little minds of the future? And so I think just having the conversation and continuing that conversation about how do we be inclusive of youth and bringing youth into those leadership opportunities is incredibly important to the success of our communities.
And keeping them in the rural communities. Mark, last word, take us home here.
Oh man, look, we said this about a lot of the startup communities, 20 years ago when I was getting started in Seattle. And Brad Feld is famous for, you always have to have the 20-year vision, and that restarts every single day. Yeah. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can borrow from a lot, building networks like this. But good. We've got at least 20 years to go, and whatever we're learning today, it's going to be irrelevant in another 10 years, and we'll have another 20 years to go. So.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you for everybody who joined us today. We really appreciate it. Rural communities, it's where it's at. Mark, thank you. Christy, thank you so much. SBIR, STTR, the Women Business Center, we really appreciate it. And all the work that you're doing in Colorado. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And also thank you to the SBA for hosting us today. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.